Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Kermit Whitfield. I'm a member of CMC's Board of Trustees and AVP of Communications at United Way of Central Ohio. It's great to see everyone here today, and we've got a very full room, so thanks for coming out. Today's forum, Fake News is an Oxymoron, is presented with support from Dispatch Media Group, Columbus Business First, and WBNS 10 TV, and in partnership with PRSA. Each are represented here today by many guests and associates. Won't you please help me thank them? And let's welcome Nick Fortini, President and Publisher of Columbus Business First, to introduce our forum. Nick?
Thank you, Kermit. Columbus Business First is proud to support the Columbus Metropolitan Club and its mission to engage our community in conversations on important topics. And as publisher, today's topic is extremely important and personal, as it touches on the single most important right in a free society, and that is the right of a free press. Indeed, when news is dubbed fake, it is truly an oxymoron. And for the record, I can't stand the term fake news. You know, this is a relatively new term, like alternative facts. We used to call those lies and falsehoods. Now it's fake news. So every hour of every day, high-quality journalism is happening in newsrooms throughout the world, including right here in Ohio and in Columbus. Stories are being produced that are informative, educational, thought-provoking, poignant, well-sourced, and 100% factual. So I look forward to today's discussion and perspectives on how to combat this new phenomenon known as fake news. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Alan Miller is editor of the Columbus Dispatch. Kelly Frank is director of news and digital content at WBNS 10 TV. Gleb Tispersky is assistant professor of history at The Ohio State University. And Clark Donnelly is news director at Columbus Radio Group. Clark, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. And welcome to the Post-Truth Society. Wasn't all that truth just a burden anyway? Woke up Sunday morning, started looking at my Twitter feed, and there was a most fascinating story about how from the book Fire and Fury that was being released that weekend, President Trump, on one of his first nights in the White House, became infuriated because he changed the channel on the TV and could not find the Gorilla channel. According to this excerpt from the book, Mr. Trump believed that there was, in fact, a channel on television that offered 24-hour, 7-day-a-week gorilla-related material. It looked real, but it wasn't. It was just a bit of parody. However, hundreds of Twitter users picked it up and shared it with their friends. A team of college students has come up with an internet browser plugin that will identify fake and biased news stories and then steer users to alternative and more accurate articles. That is coming out of Yale University. It's called Open Mind, and it's an extension of the Google Chrome browser. Around the country, state lawmakers have introduced or passed bills calling on public school systems to develop lessons for a form of instruction called media literacy. They want schools to include lessons on how to evaluate and analyze sources of information in civics, language arts, science, and other subjects. In other words, teaching kids how to recognize when something is accurate and when something is fake. Today we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we want to start, first of all, with a definition. And we'll just go down, let's open up to the panel here. Anyone who wants to speak first. In your definition, what is fake news?
Made up. But my definition doesn't necessarily apply to what I hear from readers who call some of what they see in the Dispatch or elsewhere as fake news. What they are often describing as fake news is that which they don't like. And my feeling is you don't get to pick your facts. You can pick your opinion, but you can't pick your facts. And because you don't like the facts doesn't make it fake news. So, I mean, it used to be that things like The Onion and Mad Magazine were fake news, and we all knew that because it's satire, it's parody. But when people start calling things fake news, not all of you will be able to see this, but it's probably big enough that most of you can. This is the kind of mail I get occasionally from people when they don't like what we print. And I don't know whether this is magic marker or blood, but it says, this is fake news. And it's a story about Bill O'Reilly. This is from back in April when Bill O'Reilly the news came out that he was linked to a lot of harassment settlements. Fake news? I think not. But somebody didn't like it.
I'll add that it's really in the perception of. I mean, the term itself has just taken on such life, especially in the last 2 years, that we can sit in the literal sense, and I 100% agree with Alan, but it's also, fake news is what our consumer, our user, our viewer, our reader, determines it to be. And we have a unique challenge now of not only going out and telling those stories, but then defending them and even proving verification of said news. So I'll add that.
Well, as an academic, I'll have to go with the dictionary definition. So Collins Dictionary in 2017 picked fake news as its word of the year, defining it as false, often sensationalized information that is spread often for political purposes. So that is a good definition of fake news. But what does fake news look like in the real world? Well, there was a protest in Texas in 2016, and there were two dueling groups. One group was the Heart of Texas, which was a conservative-leaning group, and that was one group that was coming to a rally. And there was another group called United Muslims of America. And they were both coming to a rally at the same time. And they didn't know they were coming to a rally that was going to be at the same time. One was an anti-Islamic rally by the Heart of Texas against Islamization, and another was to protect the rights of Muslims in America by United Muslims of America. And they were both organized by separate Facebook pages that were sharing a lot of false news stories. One was about how Muslims were persecuted and so on. One was about how Sharia law was taking over in the United States. And both of those sources were organized by Russia, by the Russian Internet Research Agency. And they resulted in Americans fighting each other in a rally in Texas. That's what fake news is. That is the real definition of fake news. That is what we can viscerally identify as fake news, not a dictionary definition. People fighting each other in the streets as a result of getting false information fed by propaganda agents. That is the real definition of fake news to me.
I'm not supposed to have an opinion, but they have actually described what I believe are two different definitions of fake news. There are two different kinds. There's real fake news and there's fake news. Professor Sapersky has described real fake news, which is actually fake. Kelly and Helen have described fake news, which is news that's accurate, but with which you disagree. So, not only is it an oxymoron, but it has two different definitions.
And an interesting thing, I was just reading in preparation somewhat for this day, Marist conducted a poll on the most annoying words. They do it every year. Number one was whatever, and number two, very close behind, was the term fake news, as what Americans have identified as the most annoying term of the last year.
Unfortunately, whatever keeps hanging in there.
Yes, it does.
Well, then let me ask you all three, what is so dangerous about fake news? Nick mentioned that the free press is perhaps the most fundamental right in a democracy, at least a working one. So what's so dangerous about fake news, either real fake news or fake news?
Ignorance. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll let those two speak first.
Well, Gleb just described a very real situation, which is quite dangerous when people start fighting each other because somebody whipped them up and put them in a place based on falsehoods. But it plays out in far more mundane ways, if you want to characterize it that way, and locally. It's easy to frame this all up in terms of presidential politics because it comes up so frequently there. But, we had a case in Columbus where a man walked into a restaurant with a machete and started hacking away at people who were there to eat their dinner. And he was chased away, heroes in the room fended him off. He ran from police, and he ended up being shot and killed. So nobody could ever question him about his motives. He didn't leave a note. There was virtually nothing in his apartment to indicate why he had done this. Some people who knew him suggested that maybe he had some mental issues, which seems like a possibility, right? Yet, when we wrote story after story, I don't want to make it sound like it was a book, but we followed the story as it unfolded and we reported on it. And when we didn't report that he was a Muslim terrorist, we got call after call after call and email after email from people saying, why are you not telling us that this man is a Muslim terrorist? Because we have no indication or evidence that he is. That's why. And so finally I got a call from somebody who wanted to know why we weren't doing this, and I said, by the way, where are you getting this? Why do you think that he's a Muslim terrorist? Well, because I heard it on the radio, not Clark's station, by the way. So I drilled down a little bit, and I found that she was listening to a talk show host on an AM radio station who was saying things, that would suggest that perhaps he was a Muslim terrorist. So I said, well, here's the difference. Talk show paid to whip up an audience versus news gathering operation. And we're not going to report it as news until we have it verified. By the way, there's a saying in a newsroom that if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So that's the kind of test we put to this. And so I had this person on the phone. I said, if you would, just hold on a minute. I'm going to go see if we have any new information on this. So I asked Earl Reinhardt, who recently retired from the Dispatch and was covering the story, if he would call the FBI and ask them again, is there any evidence that this man is a Muslim terrorist? And he did, and there was not. So, we're not going to report it if it's not news, if it's not fact. And yet there are people out there who so desperately want to believe that their beliefs are true and fact that that in their mind becomes fact. And that's easy to, I know you want to speak to this, it's very easy for this to happen in this day and age because the media or the information sources are so fractured that you can lock into any channel that you want to lock into and never move from it. And it will just continue to reinforce this belief that you have about politics or about Muslim terrorists or whatever the case may be. And you never have to open your mind to the possibility that it might be wrong.
One completely different danger that I see from fake news comes with how people that are in editorial positions have to make decisions in terms of how we dispatch crews and what we cover and what we do. And the reason why I point that out is, we are tasked with seeking out the truth and reporting on that and being completely unbiased in that. And when fake news becomes so prolific and you have situations like what happened in Texas, instead of sitting and talking about, is this a relevant story to the public, we're now talking about, okay, do I have security to go with them? How are we going to get in? Is this safe? Should we even be doing this story because of the potential, whether it's life danger, whatever the case may be? A great example, this table to the right is filled with a lot of my news management staff. We're going to spend 3 hours tomorrow going through active shooter training. And that is part mental illness, but it's also because of the fact that these emotions and these groups and these very passionate, one way or another, groups get so stirred up by this information that isn't necessarily verified. There is a whole new danger to going out and telling stories. And I faced it when I was at CNN, and we would talk about covering Egypt, and we would have people that were kidnapped. Anderson Cooper was missing for a while in Syria. We had Ben Wiedemann in Egypt. These were very, very dangerous situations. Where I worry about it as a journalist is, at what point then will organizations, whether it's CBS, CNN, or 10 TV, stop sending our people out? Or even worse, will people not want to do it? And then you lose those folks that are out there trying to find the truth and the information. So that, it's a very ... but when I see fake news, that's one of the things that in my core frightens me.
I think those are very dangerous things, but I worry even more about ordinary people in their office, in their shop, in their store. How many of you have heard about Pizzagate? Raise your hand. That's fake news spread about Hillary Clinton having, which false statements, a sex scandal, sex ring in a pizza shop, resulted in somebody going to the pizza shop and shooting up that pizza store. Now, what if the scandal was about Hillary Clinton having a sex scandal in a lawyer or in a bank or anywhere? Any one of you can be in a place of business, and there can be an idea spread about your business being a venue for some kind of by fake news that will really threaten you. And somebody might go and shoot up your place. Just this morning, I saw a story about Starbucks, some Starbucks outside of Atlanta, Georgia, that there was a rumor spread that a black employee was, poisoning the drinks of some white customers. The Starbucks had to shut down for a while because there were threats called into the place. That's what fake news is. Fake news is for everyone. It's not for, it's not for just for journalists. It's not just for TV. It's for all of you. It's for all of us. It can happen to anyone, literally. And I was talking to Kip Morse, who is the Central Ohio Better Business Bureau chief, and he was telling me that he's really concerned about fake news really hurting business because it's destroying the atmosphere of trust in our society. It's really destroying everything that we can hold true. Fake news leads to fake reviews, which undermines businesses. Fake news leads to various businesses being threatened when they're associated with one political candidate or another unfairly or fairly. This is the kind of consequences that result from fake news. Not to speak of the political, federal politics, which really are greatly threatened by fake news. I mean, let's say the false rumors that Donald Trump won the popular vote when Hillary Clinton actually won by 3 million votes. When we look at polls, there was a Qualtrics poll conducted of Donald Trump supporters in December, and it found that over half of his supporters believed that he won the popular vote. So you could see how that, of course, that would cause him to be perceived to have more legitimacy if he won the popular vote, which is the essence of the matter. So it goes all the way from your business, wherever you are, to the whole atmosphere of trust for businesses in our society, to presidential politics and people believing in falsehoods. And that's the problem.
So if I could speak to this issue of trust for a second, I feel compelled as a journalist to represent our critics here for a second, and note that journalism has done some of its own damage. It's self-inflicted when it comes to some level of trust, in that we, various among us, have made mistakes, large and small. Those erode trust. We acknowledge that. Some of us do a better job than others of correcting those mistakes when they happen. So I acknowledge that we in journalism have done some damage to ourselves, and we wear that every day. But we also try very hard to fix those errors, to correct those mistakes when we make them. I also have been hearing more and more frequently from people who are concerned about anonymous sources appearing in particular, stories about the White House. And I think you can all think for a second about why that is. Those stories would not exist if not for someone being able to speak freely, which they could not do if their names were attached to those stories, because they would be fired, if not worse. So on one hand, we have stories that have anonymous sources in them that we would not know about otherwise, and I think that makes them important. They should be reported. On the other hand, the use of those stories, whether we write them or they come from wire services, more often than not, it's a wire service story for us. I recognize that those anonymous sources open a crack in the door for doubt, which helps erode trust. So I have tried to address that in our audience by telling people that I know these people. The ones who are reporting for the New York Times or the Washington Post or some of the others, AP. I mean, there are people in all of those newsrooms who worked in our newsroom here in Columbus, former interns who now cover the Justice Department or criminal justice for the Washington Post. There are people at the Associated Press in New York and in Moscow and elsewhere who worked in Ohio, grew up in Ohio. They have Midwestern values. They are us. I know that they become these faceless reporters across the globe when you only see a byline in print, but they are people that I hope that you will trust. I do because I know them, and I hope that by extension you can know them. Anyway, these are issues that are floating around out there that I recognize we as media people have to deal with. And it's very challenging because trust is low and doubt is great. So we're working on that.
And I presume when you're dealing with anonymous sources, you've got internally your systems of checks and balances, which any reputable, credible organization will. If a reporter, if a Glenn McIntyre has a source and he comes to me and he says, I have this source, I have it hard, he has been here in this market for years, and I'm going to believe that. Now, I may ask him a few questions, and I may ask, can you give me that identity, just so I can answer questions if I have to answer them down that line. That happens with our investigative unit as well. But there's never not a process of checks and balances where we'll sit and say, oh, yeah, okay, run with that. There's always going to be, additional voices, especially when it comes to anonymous sources.
Having outlined some of the dangers and some of the pitfalls, what sort of advice can you give these folks, who are all news consumers, to help them avoid those things? What do we do to improve our own role as consumers of news and information so that we don't become a part of the problem by continuing to pass along information that was bad when it got to us and probably worse when it left us?
Click through. I mean, really, Gleb was talking about this. This is something that I think we all are aware of. But how many times do you glance at a headline, maybe not this room, but how many times do you glance at a headline in social media and then go, ooh, share, without really clicking through and reading from top to bottom? And I think he has the actual data. I will defer to the academic on that one. But the number is high of people who actually don't click through and educate themselves.
Yeah, so to cite the data, there's a study showed that people believe the headline and just get their news from headlines about 60% of the time. And let me be clear, it's something that we have to remember. This room is atypical. You came to a presentation on fake news. You're part of the Columbus Metropolitan Club. We're talking about the average American. The average American clicks through and doesn't click through most of the time. And so they get their news just from reading the headlines, and then they share that. And the problem is here, we're going to systemic incentives. People don't have a systemic incentive to believe what they see on Facebook because it comes from friends. And I know I'll leave it a little bit to Alan to talk about a study that he found about this. But basically, people trust their friends to share accurate information. And this is hugely problematic. So if we look at the 2016 election, the 3 months before the 2016 election, the top 20 fake news stories got about 8 million engagements on Facebook, which means likes, shares, and comments, election-related news stories. If we look at the top 20 real news stories, and we're talking about fake news stories created by Russia Today and other propaganda websites, real news stories from Wall Street Journal, from New York Times, and so on, got 7 million engagements. In the election, in the months before the election, the real news stories related to the election was outcompeted by fake news stories. We also have studies that show that people believe fake news stories at a very high rate. At about 75% to 80% of people recall as accurate fake news stories when they're shown the headlines later. So people believe this stuff, and that's what forms their perceptions. So if we want to fight that, we need to fight that at the systemic incentive level. People, what the research shows about why people share fake news is, A, because they feel it will help their tribe, their identity, whatever political category they believe. B, it will, nobody will catch them out when they do it. And C, they think that everybody else does it. So in order to address this problem, we need to address these things. And that's what the Pro-Truth Pledge is about. And the Pro-Truth Pledge flyers on your table. So the Pro-Truth Pledge is an effort developed at Ohio State University and several other universities around the country to get people to commit to the facts. All of us to commit to behaviors like fact-checking information before we share it, calling out people who are on our side if they share inaccurate information, and celebrating other people for updating their beliefs, for changing their minds. And what we want to do is get everyone in this room, around the country, politicians, journalists, private citizens, bankers, lawyers, everyone, to take the Pro-Truth Pledge, to commit to the Pro-Truth Pledge. The more private citizens take it, if you're not a public figure, the more private citizens take it, the more incentives public figures will have to take it. People like journalists, like my esteemed colleagues here in the panel, and some people in this room have taken it, people like Clark Donnelly and Nick Fortin, who are involved in this presentation, people like Bob Fitrakis and so on, who are in the journalism business. Politicians like Mike Stenziano, the council pro tem member of the Columbus City Council, and many others that I can name. And the goal is to get as many people as possible to commit to it, sign the pledge, give their information about why they're committed to it, and that will get more and more public figures to take it because they know that we are watching and they are getting positive reputation benefits from taking the Pro-Truth Pledge because the information about them taking the Pro-Truth Pledge is shared with all private citizens who took the Pro-Truth Pledge. So it's a virtuous cycle. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. These public figures get to display the Pro-Truth Pledge website seal on their websites. Journalists can display that, politicians display that, and so on. It's kind of like the Better Business Bureau for public figures. So for honesty, where Better Business Bureau is for ethical behavior in business, the Pro-Truth Pledge is for trustworthiness in telling the truth. And so the more people take it, the more incentives they have.
So the study that Gleb mentioned is the Pew Research Group produced a study that found that people put more stock in the person sharing a story than in the source, the original source of the story. So if you think about that in terms of how you behave on social media, you are a trusted source for your friends and family. And even benignly, I'm sure some, maybe many of us at one time or another have shared a photo because we liked it. Think about the note you get back when someone liked something that you post. What I see often says, someone liked your photo. Well, most of the time, there is a story attached to that photo that I shared. And if by chance I had shared just a photo and not paid any attention to the story attached to it, I could have unwittingly shared bad information with somebody. So now back to Clark's question, how can we combat this in our personal lives? Be discerning readers. If your mom says she loves you, check it out. Apply that to the stories that you read and then feel tempted to share. And if it doesn't feel right, if it doesn't have a byline, if it goes back to a website that has no about button on it so that you can find out who works for this organization that produced this thing that you're thinking about sharing, these are signs that it might be garbage and maybe you should stay away from it. So be discerning readers, don't share garbage, and subscribe to a newspaper. That's my shameless. Actually, multiple would be good. I mean, and that newspapers, whatever. You really should read multiple stories from many news sources so that you're not locking into one channel, but opening your mind to the possibility that that there are other angles or viewpoints on the topics that you're interested in.
Well, and to that, I would say, I would love for everybody to, watch Channel 10 all the time, but I know that a majority of people are getting their news from Facebook. And thankfully, in the last 30 days, Facebook has taken some responsibility and ownership for the giant influence they have had over, ideologies everywhere. And they used to combat fake news with just a disputed flag and just put disputed. And now, to Alan's point, in educating and becoming a discernible reader, they're now adding contextual articles on anything that they identify through a third-party group as fake news. That is part coming out of the Journalism Project in Facebook, which is a growing project that I hopefully will continue in this direction. But they're adding context, and the idea is that you read related topics so you can do exactly what Alan just said.
In a few minutes, we're going to open up the microphone at the back of the room there to questions. So don't be shy. Step right up. We are going to share a few final thoughts while you gather your courage and your wording. One thing I'm curious about, do we as human beings have built-in biases? And if so, do you know what they are and how to deal with them in your various roles as academics and as journalists?
Yes, we do. Of course. We all grow up in a particular place, in a particular environment. I'll never know what it feels like to be African American and or a woman, and so therefore I know that when we're writing stories that are on those topics or others from which I have little experience, that it's important for us to get other viewpoints from the people who are representative of those ethnic or racial or gender groups or political parties or whatever the case may be, that we test ourselves to make sure that what we're about to represent in a headline or in a story is both accurate and sensitive to the interests of those it represents. So you can test your biases if you're willing to recognize that you have them.
Great.
Professor Tversky, I know this is an area of your expertise.
So we as human beings are not evolved for the modern world. We are evolved for the savanna environment. We're evolved to live in small tribes of maybe several dozen people, 150 at most. So situations where we are in those contexts, like when we're with people we know well and we've known them for a while, we will tend to not be so as biased. When we are in situations like dealing with Facebook or dealing with news sources of various situations, we don't know what they're coming from. Our intuitions, our gut reactions are not going to be correct. So I'm going to disagree a little bit with Alan about saying what feels right. If it feels wrong, don't do it. I'm going to tell you that if it feels right, you need to be especially wary. You need to be especially careful because your gut intuition will not steer you well. Your gut reactions will often cause you to make mistakes. And in order to address those sorts of things, what can we do? That's one of the purposes of the Pro-Truth Pledge. How can we address that? There's research showing that if you make a commitment to ethical behaviors before engaging in a situation which might challenge your ethical behaviors, your desire to be your best self, you'll be much more likely to be your best self in that context. So for example, if people are shown, there was a study that showed that if students are shown the 10 Commandments before they engage in a test, they're going to be much less likely to cheat because they're reminded of ethical standards, even if they're secular or something like that. It still reminds them of their ethics. So the Pro-Truth Pledge, one of the purposes of the Pro-Truth Pledge is to call us to be our best selves, to help us change our incentives. So this is all about incentives. If we go back to the environmental movement of the 1960s, the way it started, everyone was polluting. People weren't really caring about the environment. And you know what it took? It took a small group of organized citizens who said, hey, the system is broken. And right now, we're living in a broken system. We're living in a broken system of information. We're getting information from Facebook, not necessarily in this room, but the large majority of the American population is getting their information from Facebook, from other social media sources. They're not really paying attention to the byline. They're not paying attention to the quality of journalism, to the hours and days of effort it took to fact check their information. They don't realize that if they don't pay for the information, for that information by subscribing to the newspaper or listening to the radio or watching the TV with the advertisements, then the information won't be coming to them. So we're in a situation like the early environmentalists, where we, the people who understand the problem, we need to be responsible. Every one of us here needs to take personal responsibility for being part of the solution, not being part of the problem, for subscribing to the newsletter, and so on.
I hate to
Whatever
cut you
need
off,
do.
but it's time to take audience questions. That is a tradition here at the Columbus Metropolitan Club. So please step up to the microphone. Just give us your name. Ask us your question. We do have a lot of folks who want, so let's try to steer clear of editorial commentary. Just ask that question straightforwardly, and we will get an answer for you.
Good afternoon. My name's Charlie Rodenfels. I think you've got an audience here, at least people that are my age and older, that would understand the name of Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley. I kind of think the journalism profession is so far removed from what we all enjoyed 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and we're, at least people like myself, we're very, very hungry for that, because it was like going to the dentist and he says you have a cavity. Well, you had a cavity and you didn't doubt it and you didn't think about it. Go ahead and fill it. Or you went to your doctor and he said, got an irregular heartbeat. Well, you didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it, and you didn't have to check another opinion. You didn't have to keep reading and reading and reading to see, is he lying to me? Is he giving me fake news? Is he taking news and twisting it so it solves his needs? So is there an opportunity that we could all head back towards the world of Walter Cronkite, David Brinkley?
Alan, you and I are closer to that world than most of us.
I'm probably older than you think.
Go ahead.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, agreed.
There's absolutely no chance we will go back to that world. We are in a situation of disruption. So when we imagine the pristine environment of 1850s America, you know, this is the same thing as saying in the 1960s with the pollution, how can we go back to that pristine environment of 1850s America? There's no way. We are in a situation of disruption. We can't hope to go back to horses and buggies. We need to live in the modern world, and this is why the Pro-Truth Pledge is invented for the modern world. This is why we're talking about subscribing to newspapers. Use your money, use your reputation, use your credibility where it can do the most good to make a change. We need to live in the world where we are, not in the world where we ideally would like to hope to be of the world of the past.
I think,
I was going to say, I think part of what I heard in that question is, can you just make it easy again?
Yeah.
It's not easy, and it never really was. I mean, to have one or two or three voices telling you this is the way it was today, I don't want to go back to that. I embrace the fact that we have so many sources, but that means that all of us have to work harder at making sure that we're picking reliable sources. That's not that hard once you figure it out.
yes, I mean, I agree. I mean, and I think just one thing from a slightly academic standpoint, the data tells us that's not what the majority wants. Television stations wouldn't start to expand and become full media operations the way I now, oversee social and digital and broadcast, which is now its own separate, distinct platform, because in droves, people went away from it. So I think there's in that question, which thank you, there's two things. You have platform, and then you have persona attached to credibility. So I think in that case, you have a couple different things at play there.
All right, ma'am.
Yes, it's Deborah Matthews. My question is that when, for the last year and a half, I have gone on the internet to check out facts, if you put the fact that you're looking for on their sites, they come up with the 25 items that they've checked out recently, but you don't get an answer to the question that you have asked. How do you get an answer to a specific question on things like fact check and snoops.com?
Well, I mean, there are different organizations, certainly FactCheck.org, and I'm not backing any of these, but there are certain organizations out there. The one thing I would do is educate yourself on who runs those sites. The challenge is with like a blanket Google search is somebody can attach AMP to it, or they're paying, you'll have paid search, which now is clearly identified, gratefully, but it also, people still pay to have their particular information escalated. So it's in part looking to see if that's in fact what's occurred as you look at the blurb that you're clicking through, and then taking that extra added step of looking at who is behind that site. It doesn't necessarily solve your problem, because then if you don't get what you're looking for, you have to continue to read because the information, is so prolific. But I think it's again going out and drilling down to who is responsible for what you are seeing, or buy a paper, because then you know.
Well, and if you're struggling with that, I might suggest that you visit your local library and find a library researcher who can help you drill down into a real refined search.
Right.
Thank you very much. Next question.
I'm John Lowe III. I'm a retired professor. In all the talk so far, I think I've only heard the name Trump mentioned once. I had never heard the term fake news until I heard it from him. And whether he invented it or not, he certainly seems to me to be the biggest abuser of the term. You mentioned some people use it to refer to anything they don't like. That's what I hear from him. Would you agree with that or not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now we have time for more questions.
Well, I think it was something different 5 years ago. False news, fake news was something that wasn't accurately reported, or a mistake in an article or an on-air report or something that was written. It certainly became, a political term with our current president, and one that's, again, used to deflect anything that he disagrees with.
And there's, I think, an important distinction between an inaccuracy, an honest mistake, a typo, and fake news. There's nothing insidious about spelling my name with two N's. All right, it's wrong, but it's not fake news.
Yes, Eric Brown, and currently a member of the Columbus School Board. And just as Alan did with respect to his profession, I think the schools need to do much more in teaching our young people to be skeptical, in bringing a healthy skepticism, to be critical readers, to question things. And we share part of that responsibility in the world of education. I do get majority of my news and information from online, including Facebook. Bringing healthy skepticism and a critical eye to that material allows me to have confidence in what I look at and read. But the question I have for you is, what's different today than ever before? Yes, we have a term that is a couple of years old with fake news and alternative facts, but we've had propaganda forever. We've had deceptive advertising forever. We've needed to develop and bring those skills of a critical eye to all of the information that we've always gotten for decades, for probably centuries. What's different today than ever before?
I'll give you three things. One, not everybody does what you just described, applying the critical eye. Two, there's this blurring of lines between opinion and news, especially on 24-hour news operations. I mean, if you hear somebody start a sentence with "I think," whatever follows that, you should probably just throw out. I mean, it's if they think it's going to be their opinion, right? So they're not necessarily delivering you news. And the third point I forgot. So
I'd add accessibility. Everybody didn't have a cell phone in their pocket or something that had a million different things coming at them. Accessibility to information. I use the word loosely.
And I would add the deliberate efforts to create misinformation by Russia especially, flooding our market with misinformation, and other as well foreign agents and sources and domestic agents that are deliberately making an effort to do so. So that would be another huge, huge, huge contributor to the pie.
All right, next question, please.
Tom Borgerding, avid news consumer now. I have a question for Alan and Kelly. I especially enjoy the investigative stories, both in the paper and on television. But I have a question about the digitization of public records. And as you as editors find that it's either easier or more difficult to get information from public agencies now that most public records have been digitized. Are there walls that have been put up further, or how would you characterize, rather than going down to City Hall, for instance, and rifling through paper records? Is it more difficult or less now?
It depends. I think, sometimes there's still man-woman power involved if people want to blockade, or it's not like we can log in and get every single thing we want when we are, using our right to pursue records that might be somewhat more controversial. There are certainly blockades, but I don't know, I've got my investigative VP sitting over here. He could probably answer this a little bit more clearer, but I think it just depends on the case.
Digitizing the records doesn't have any bearing, in my view, on whether it's available or not. We
Yeah.
face a daily challenge in getting access to public records
Right.
because more and more we find that public entities are saying no. So we have to fight to get access to them.
It's like an insurance company, where the first answer might be no, and so then you have to go to your attorney, you have to draft a letter, and you're well in your right to have that document, but that's now at the level that we are. To get basic things, we have to get an attorney involved. It's a who's going to call the bluff and do it.
All right, next question, please.
Hi, Pete Scalia, 10 TV. Hi, boss.
Hi.
I was thinking when Eric asked that question of what's changed, and when you think of technology, and you talked about the delivery, the fact that we could do so much with these devices. Not only do we get information, but you can do some pretty incredible things with these. Visually, I could put my co-anchor, Angela Ann, in nearly any situation I want on this. There's software.
I've seen.
Which you have seen. But there's software where you can type something in that will perfectly emulate someone's voice. When you go beyond a simple cell phone, technology probably is one of the biggest things that has definitely changed, not just in delivery, but in that sort of thing. And when you talk about the manipulation of video and of audio and of things that it's difficult to even forensically prove if these things are real, how can we protect ourselves, not just as news consumers, but as journalists, if we're given something that, it sort of defies our senses, that it fools our eyes, it fools our ears, but we have it. Moving forward in this age of technology, what are some ways that we can vet that what we see and hear is real?
Go ahead.
I heard a
Nick?
good answer in your question, and that
Yeah.
is if it doesn't look real or if it's too good to be true, then it's probably something that you ought to investigate further. That's one thing.
And I think you have to have responsible leadership, like the man to my left. I think, and not even leadership, everybody that's involved in the process of telling a story. I can think of something very recently where early on we got access to documents, emails, and it had to do with Wes Goodman, I believe. And we had been sitting on it for a couple of weeks before it was public. And I met with our investigative VP, and we kept reading through, and we could not verify. It was given to us by a third party, and we kept going through. And then the Washington Post went ahead and published some of them. I don't know. I can't speak to whether or not they were able to track down and actually get access to it because, to your point, anything could be forged. Now, there are leaders who will absolutely say, run with it, hang it on the Washington Post. There are people like our group, and we collectively decided and got beat on the story to not put it out there because, as a group, it was more important for us to be right than to be first. And when we were messing with really serious allegations involving young men and a political leader, it was not a gamble that any of us was willing to take. Now, I think in your case, Pete, where you're talking about technology, it comes back down to making those decisions. Can I verify it? Can I not? And again, the decision makers, especially the decision makers, it is so important to take that decision with the gravitas it requires. And unfortunately, I think that doesn't happen in many newsrooms. That's why I'm proud of these guys.
All right, we can take one last question. Needs to be a short one.
Hi, Bob. I hear global warming all the time. I read it in the newspaper, the little dispatch thing. We talk about the things that happened over the globe in the last year or so, couple weeks. When I was a kid in the 60s, we were talking about global cooling. Well, Northwest Ohio is flat because we've had 3 to 5 glaciers. But each one of those glaciers died. It melted. That wasn't a weekend process. That was 10,000, 20,000 years. Another 30,000 years to make the glacier. Yet all we ever hear about is global warming. This planet has warmed and cooled for millions of years. And all I hear is global warming, global warming. I work outdoors. We are warmer. But we're going to get cooler again. And nothing people can do is really going to change that. We spend millions of dollars to do what?
So what's the question?
Why is it every time I read the newspaper you talk about fake news? Well, it's always global warming. Why don't you have a side that says, there's another side to global warming? And it's
We generally talk about climate change, which is fact. And we quote those who are researchers and work in this field. We're not the experts, but the people that we quote are. And,
thank you.
and we could probably stand here all day and debate about whether the world is warming and going to cool again, but I'm going to leave that one to the experts.
All right.
Yeah, and this is one reason why the question has been more framed as climate change, global climate change than global warming. There's diversity and so on. I want to mention that for those who signed the Pro-Truth Pledge, there's a table outside, right outside, where you can leave it, and Gary Monty, who is in the red shirt, can help you direct it where to pick it up, right outside. Thank you.
Sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but that wraps up our discussion for this afternoon. Thank you very much. Going to turn it back over to Kermit Whitfield.
Thank you, Clark. I hope everybody enjoyed today's forum. I know I certainly did. We encourage you to continue the conversation with coffee and cookies. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio Channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Let's thank our sponsors, Dispatch Media Group, Columbus Business First, WBNS 10 TV, and our partner PRSA, and of course our speakers Alan Miller, Kelly Frank, Gleb Sapersky, and Clark Donnelly. Thank you for being here. See you next week.